On the morning of April 12th, 1981, a 50-year-old astronaut named John Young ate breakfast at the Kennedy Space Center, pulled on a pressure suit, and climbed into a spacecraft that had never flown. No American vehicle had ever carried a crew on its very first flight into space. This one did, and it worked. The Space Shuttle would go on to fly 135 missions over 30 years, build a space station, rescue a telescope, and become the most recognizable flying machine on Earth. It was sold to the American public as the vehicle that would make spaceflight cheap, safe, and routine. It became none of those three things, and on July 21st, 2011, it rolled to a stop in the Florida darkness for the last time. Retired not because something better existed, but because the country finally admitted the promise could not be kept. The promise was born from a budget crisis. In January 1972, President Nixon approved the shuttle program at less than a fifth of what NASA had spent going to the moon, and the agency survived the cut by making an extraordinary claim. A reusable spaceplane, the pitch went, would fly up to 50 times a year and slash the cost of orbit to a fraction of a throwaway rocket's price. The numbers in the sales brochures assumed the shuttle would launch so often it would carry every American satellite, military, and civilian alike. To win the Air Force's business, NASA agreed to give the vehicle enormous delta wings so it could swing 1,000 miles sideways during re-entry to serve military missions. The wings stayed for 30 years. Most of the military missions never came. What emerged from the factories was the most intricate flying machine ever attempted. The orbiter was the size of a mid-sized airliner, but it rode to space bolted to a rust-colored fuel tank 15 stories tall and two solid rocket boosters that could not be shut off once lit. The first solid rockets ever trusted with human beings. Its three main engines, built by Rocketdyne, ran at temperatures and pressures no production engine had ever survived, and each one was designed to be flown again and again. The belly wore a skin of roughly 24,000 silica tiles, nearly every one a unique shape, glued on by hand, each capable of shrugging off 3,000 degrees. The test program itself became a piece of American folklore. The first orbiter off the line was supposed to be named Constitution, until fans of the television series Star Trek buried the White House in letters, and in 1976 the vehicle rolled out as Enterprise instead, with most of the show's cast standing in the crowd. Enterprise never reached space. It was dropped from a modified Boeing 747 over the California desert in 1977 to prove the machine could land. But the name told the country exactly what it believed it was buying: the future. Getting to the pad took 2 years longer than promised, and both of the program's miracle technologies were the reason. The main engines kept destroying themselves on the test stands in Mississippi, turbine blades cracking, pumps catching fire, one full engine lost in a test explosion. And the tiles proved so fragile and so poorly glued that hundreds shook loose, while the first orbiter was still riding across the country on the back of its carrier aircraft. Technicians pulled tiles off, densified them, and re-glued them one at a time, a job that consumed more than a year. By the time Columbia finally stood on the pad, the routine space plane of the brochures had already revealed itself to be the most maintenance-hungry vehicle ever assembled. Then came April 12th, 1981. Young and his rookie pilot, Robert Crippen, rode the stack upright off the pad on a pillar of flame. Two men in ejection seats bolted inside a vehicle whose main engines had a habit of exploding on the test stand, and whose heat shield had never been proven in flight. The mission lost 16 tiles on the way up. It landed anyway, gliding onto a dry lake bed in California like an airliner coming home. And the crowds that met it treated the landing as the opening day of a new era of routine spaceflight. If you grew up in the 1980s, the shuttle was simply what the word spaceship meant. You watched launches on a television rolled into a classroom on a cart, with the sound turned up so the room could hear the countdown. You knew the names of the orbiters the way you knew baseball teams: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis. If you lived anywhere near the Cape or Edwards, you learned the double sonic boom that announced a returning orbiter. 2 minutes before anyone could see it, a 1-2 thump that rattled windows and told an entire county to look up. And if you built the plastic model kit, you knew the orbiter attached to its tank, slightly nose down and crooked, and it bothered you, and you were right that it mattered. You also learned, if you followed the program at all, the particular ritual of the scrub. The countdown would hold at 9 minutes, a valve or a sensor or a bank of Florida clouds would fail inspection, and the television announcer would explain that today was not the day. Veterans of the viewing stands packed accordingly. Same sandwiches, same folding chairs, 3 days running. The machine taught an entire generation that spaceflight meant waiting, and that the waiting was part of the seriousness of the thing. For a few years, the machine looked like everything promised. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space aboard Challenger. Satellites rolled out of the payload bay for paying commercial customers, and astronauts in jetpacks flew untethered to retrieve broken ones, producing some of the most famous photographs ever taken. 1985 alone saw 9 shuttle flights. NASA declared the system operational after just 4 test missions, retired the ejection seats, and began flying engineers, politicians, and payload specialists who were not career astronauts. The agency talked publicly about flying a journalist. It settled first on a school teacher. The passenger list became its own advertisement. Senator Jake Garn of Utah flew in April 1985 as a congressional observer, and Congressman Bill Nelson of Florida followed in January 1986 on the very last mission before Challenger. Small self-contained experiments rode in the payload bay for a few $1,000s under a program that let high school students and hobbyists buy their way into orbit. The message radiating from every corner of the program was deliberate and consistent. This was no longer exploration. This was a scheduled service, and ordinary people were boarding. Underneath the highlight reel, the arithmetic was failing from the first year. The turnaround plan called for an orbiter to be refurbished and reflown in 160 hours of work. The real number settled near 3 months because the tiles had to be inspected essentially one at a time, and the main engines had to be pulled and rebuilt far more often than designed. A standing army of roughly 25,000 people stood behind every launch, and that army was paid whether the shuttle flew twice a year or 9 times. The 50 flights a year in the sales pitch quietly became 24, then 12, then whatever the hardware allowed. Cost per flight, honestly accounted, was heading toward $500 million against a promise measured in tens of millions. There was a second, quieter failure in the paperwork. The joints of the solid rocket boosters built by Morton Thiokol in Utah sealed themselves with rubber O-rings, and on flight after flight, engineers recovering the spent boosters found those rings scorched and eaten by hot gas that was never supposed to reach them. The damage was documented, charted, and discussed in memos for years. Each time, the joint held, and each safe landing became the argument for flying again. Inside the program, this pattern acquired a name that would later become famous in engineering schools: the normalization of deviance. The machine was warning its builders in writing, and the schedule kept answering for them. On January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off into a Florida morning of record cold, carrying the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, with millions of children watching on classroom televisions. 73 seconds later, it broke apart 9 miles up. 7 astronauts died. The usual story is that Challenger was destroyed by a single frozen O-ring, a freak cold snap, a mechanical fluke, terrible luck. That story does not survive the record. The night before launch, Thiokol engineers led by Roger Boisjoli and Alan McDonald formally recommended against launching in the cold and were overruled after a management caucus in which one executive was asked to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. McDonald refused to sign the launch approval. The cold did not surprise the program. The program overruled the people who understood the cold. The Rogers Commission made the physics public in the simplest possible way, when the physicist Richard Feynman dropped a piece of O-ring rubber into a glass of ice water on live television and showed that it lost its spring. But the Commission's deeper finding was economic. The shuttle had been sold on a flight rate it could not achieve, and the pressure to hit that rate, to look routine, to keep the manifest, to fly the teacher before the State of the Union address, was the force that had been quietly overruling engineering for years. The O-ring was the mechanism, the schedule was the cause. The vehicle's fatal flaw was not a rubber seal. It was the promise that had won the funding in the first place. The fleet stood down for 32 months. When Discovery returned to flight in September 1988, the shuttle that came back was a different institution wearing the same skin. President Reagan had already ordered commercial satellites off the manifest, handing that business back to throwaway rockets and, in time, to Europe's Ariane. The Air Force, whose requirements had shaped the wings, abandoned its shuttle launch site in California without ever using it and went back to expendable boosters. The vehicle that was supposed to launch everything for everyone now existed mostly to fly NASA's own science and eventually to build a space station whose main political purpose was giving the shuttle somewhere to go. Even so, the machine delivered its finest hours in middle age. In 1990, it carried the Hubble Space Telescope to orbit, and when Hubble turned out to be nearsighted, only the shuttle could fix it. 5 servicing missions across 19 years, astronauts standing in the payload bay swapping instruments the size of telephone booths, turning a national embarrassment into the most productive scientific instrument in history. Beginning in 1998, shuttle crews assembled the International Space Station piece by piece, hauling up modules and truss segments that no other vehicle on Earth could carry. Whatever the shuttle cost, nothing else could do that work. It was the wrong economic answer and the only physical one. Then it happened again. On February 1st, 2003, Columbia came home from a 16-day science mission and broke apart over Texas in the morning sky. A briefcase-sized chunk of foam insulation had fallen off the fuel tank during launch and punched a hole in the left wing's leading edge, and for 16 days the wound rode along unexamined while managers waved off engineers' requests for spy satellite photos of the damage. 7 more astronauts died. The investigation board wrote the sentence the program had spent 17 years avoiding, that NASA had never fixed the culture that killed Challenger, only the joint. Foam had been falling off tanks for years. It had become normal, exactly as the O-ring burns had become normal, and the second accident was in the deepest sense a rerun of the first. The return to flight after Columbia proved the point one last time. When Discovery finally flew again in July 2005, cameras added for the mission watched another large piece of foam peel off the redesigned tank during ascent, missing the orbiter by luck. The fleet was grounded a second time before the return to flight celebration ended. 2.5 years of work and more than $1 billion had gone into fixing the exact failure that killed Columbia, and the tank shed dangerous foam anyway, because the tank had always shed foam and no redesign could fully stop it. The vehicle did not have a flaw. The vehicle was the flaw. The verdict arrived within a year. In January 2004, the White House announced the shuttle would finish the space station and retire. There was no replacement standing by, and everyone in the room knew it meant American astronauts would ride Russian rockets for years, or in the end, 9 of them. The last flights became a farewell tour. Atlantis flew the final mission in July 2011 with a crew of just 4, because there was no second shuttle left to mount a rescue if something went wrong. When its wheels stopped on the runway in the pre-dawn dark, the program had flown 135 missions across 30 years and 16 days, and roughly 9,000 people at the Cape lost their jobs within months. The price of retiring without a successor arrived immediately and kept rising. A seat on a Russian Soyuz cost NASA roughly $22 million in 2007. By the final years of the arrangement, the same seat cost over $90 million, more than quadruple because the customer had no alternative and both sides knew it. The nation that had built the most capable spacecraft in history spent nearly a decade buying rides from the rival it had beaten to the moon and paid monopoly prices for the privilege. The fleet scattered to museums, and the museums tell you what the machine had become. Discovery went to the Smithsonian's Annex in Virginia. Endeavour was towed 12 miles through the streets of Los Angeles in 2012, past crowds of more than 1 million people, with utility crews taking down power lines ahead of it and trees cut along the route. Atlantis was mounted mid-flight, cargo doors open, in a building at the Cape built around it. People wept at all three. It is difficult to name another failed program whose hardware drew a million people into the street to say goodbye. The Soviet Union delivered the strangest tribute of all. Convinced the shuttle must be a military weapon in disguise, it spent an estimated 20 billion rubles building a near exact copy called Burin, which flew once, uncrewed, in November 1988, landed itself perfectly in a crosswind, and never flew again. The country that built it dissolved 3 years later. In 2002, the hangar roof at Baikonur collapsed onto the orbiter and crushed it, killing 8 workers. The shuttle's only sibling in history died in storage, having proven that even a flawless copy of the design could not find a reason to exist. Because that is the uncomfortable truth of the shuttle. It failed only against its own brochure. As a promise of cheap, routine, safe space flight, it missed by an order of magnitude on cost, flew a tenth of the advertised rate, and killed 14 of the 852 people it carried. As a flying machine, it remains unmatched. Nothing before or since has launched like a rocket, hauled 25 tons uphill, given 7 people a shirt sleeve laboratory in orbit, grappled satellites with a robot arm, and then landed on a runway like an airplane. The engineers were not wrong about what it could do. The salesmen were wrong about what it would cost, and the engineers were made to pay the difference. The clearest monument is still overhead. The International Space Station masses close to 1,000,000 pounds, spans the area of a football field, and has been continuously occupied for over a quarter of a century, and the great majority of its pressurized modules and structural backbone rode uphill in a shuttle payload bay. No vehicle flying today could have built it, and no vehicle currently planned could rebuild it. Every crew that lives there is living inside the shuttle's cargo manifest. Its parts refused to retire even when the program did. The main engines that flew the shuttle were pulled from the orbiters and are flying again today, one flight at a time, on NASA's New Moon rocket. Veterans of Hubble missions and station flights now burning up in the Atlantic on the vehicle that replaced them. The solid boosters grew an extra segment and launched beside them. Even the rust-colored tank's tooling shaped the new rocket's core stage. The shuttle was never really replaced. It was disassembled into a museum piece in a parts bin, and the parts went back to work. The law the shuttle teaches is brutal, and it applies far beyond rockets. A machine sold on an impossible promise will eventually be operated as if the promise were true, and the gap between the two gets paid in something. For 30 years, the something was money, and twice it was people. If you were one of the kids watching from a classroom desk on a January morning in 1986, you already knew all of this before any commission reported it, because you watched the sky come apart and then watched the adults in the room try to explain it. The shuttle was the future once, and for an American generation it still is, like us, the last flying machine everyone on Earth could recognize on sight, and the most beautiful mistake its country ever made.